We want to thank Laurel very much for her presentation today, and also her flexibility and her ability to, pull out the presentation. Again, many thanks. And when she's flying to Brisbane, certainly I'll get you a bottle of wine, if not two. Now, let me talk to you. Let me introduce you, Laurel, for those of you who do not know her. Just a brief, her resume, her CV, it's like 32 pages, so I'm not going to go through them, but just basically several grants from several funders, from the Mellon Foundation to Government Canada to NSF. More importantly, or also very importantly, or more importantly, I would say, she has 3 published books, 2 of them with winners of Best Books awards. 3 of her papers have been recognized as APSA Best Papers awards. So just to put in context the kind of scholar we're having today. Her articles have appeared in Journal of Politics, Political Research Quarterly, where I got rejected 2 weeks ago. So Politics and Gender, Perspectives on Politics, Journal of Politics, so American Political Science. I also think you are one of the new, you're serving as an editor in the new APSR. So top leading scholar, again, thank you. The floor is yours, and everybody else knows how the drill goes. Laura will speak, we'll take notes, and we'll go for Q&A. Thank you again, Laura. Floor is yours.
Well, that's great. It's nice to see Farron, at least. It would be nice to see all of you, and hopefully I will get to meet you in person or more extensively at some point. It's exciting to be able to talk a little bit about my research up to the other side of the world, which, or maybe actually not so far now, since I'm in Vancouver, it's not quite as far. But thank you for making time for me today. Today I was going to talk about this book, this 2018 book published with Malatun from Cambridge University Press called Logics of Gender Justice, a Global Analysis of Women's Rights. And the book starts with a few puzzles about women's rights. And really, some of these came out of discussions or arguments really that Mala and I had about particular issues in women's rights. So first of all, one thing I definitely had noticed was that I worked my first book was on government policy on violence against women. And one of the things I noticed was that, as you're interested in maternity leave and parental leave policies, that these really exciting, innovative policies were coming out of the Nordic countries, which everybody knows, right? The Nordic countries are great, the women-friendly welfare states. But when I did work on violence against women, it was interesting to me that the Nordic states, the Scandinavian welfare states, were not really very far along in their thinking or policy development. They really were lagging, actually, in many respects. The kind of Anglo-American countries, Australia, Canada, United States. And that seemed surprising. Why would governments in one area be advancing on women's rights and not in other areas? Well, there are lots of reasons you might think about that. But actually, there were other puzzles as well. And this is something that Mala and I also noticed, which is that richer countries were not always more progressive than poorer countries. So relatedly, again, thinking about violence against women, in the 1990s, Brazil and Argentina were adopting innovative policies on violence against women. But Finland, Italy, and Spain were not, right? So you have some similarities between some of these countries. And you would think that the wealthier country would be more innovative, but it wasn't. Why was that? And then last, we saw a lot of variation in kind of what you would think would be the kind of countries that would group together, right? If you're thinking about global patterns, especially as comparativists, we group countries by region, by kind of dominant religion or family of nations, something like that, if you're a Frank Castles fan. And so then you're wondering, why do Turkey and Morocco overhaul family law, where Saudi Arabia entrenches greater inequality in family law, or Saudi Arabia doesn't really change it at all, and Iran and Indonesia entrench greater inequality in family law over the same period. So all predominantly Muslim countries, dramatically different trajectories with respect to gender equality in family law. Similarly, Ireland and Italy, both predominantly Catholic countries, very different policy patterns on both abortion and also on violence against women. So this is starting to get pretty complicated, right, as a set of kind of things that you might think would have simple explanations, right? variation across region, variation across religion, variation across within family of nation. Richer countries not necessarily more progressive than poor countries, and being progressive in one area doesn't mean you're going to be progressive in another area of women's rights. So what could explain these kind of complicated patterns? Why do we see these differences? Well, the really answer is it's sort of a trick question, right? Which you probably know. There's not one single explanatory factor for women's rights across all these issues around the whole world, right? It's a complicated question. There are no easy answers, but I just want to put a little bit more clarity on what I mean by that, though, which is that once you really pay attention and take seriously cross-issue differences in a single country and over time, but especially within a single country, right? The insight that you could be progressive on, say, violence against women and lousy on maternity leave, or great on maternity leave and lousy on abortion, or something, right? Once you figure that out, what that means is that if you think there's genuine variation, that there's not one single feature of the polity that can explain outcomes across all these different issue areas, right? So it means modernization. Well, countries have generally one level of modernization. That one level of modernization can't explain why, let's say, the US has a more developed violence against women policy and the worst maternity leave policy in the world. More democracy. Well, however democratic the country is, why would it explain why it has, more, policies on violence against women and fewer policies on, say, reproductive rights or something? It can't be women in government. There can't be one thing that explains all these areas. So we have to, it can't be patriarchy. It can't be the numbers of women in parliament. And I have the freshman women elected in 2018. It can't just be all these, the freshman class in the US Congress, I should say, in 2018. And you can see that there are more women there. And the question is, what should we expect? Well, one thing we shouldn't expect is a uniform impact across all these issues, right? Because it's just not possible. And it can't even just be feminist movements. So I've said now it's really, there's these tough answers. What is the answer? Well, we took this kind of crazy project on in a global study of 70 countries, which we looked at over the period from 1975 to 2005, and we looked at 7 issue areas, 7 distinct areas of women's rights to get at the arguments. And the key thing the kind of key takeaway from our book I've sort of touched on here is that gender equality, sex equality is multidimensional. There's not one it doesn't run along a single axis. It runs along several axes. And those axes, the axes we start by identifying, and we don't claim this to be exhaustive, are class, nation, and religion. And that these dimensions are not necessarily related to each other in a simple fashion. Doing better on class-related gender issues doesn't mean that you're going to do better on those issues that are driven more by religion. So what do I mean by dimension here? Dimension is an axis that structures society. So if we think about these kinds of big axes that divide polities, we can see that women's rights issues fall into different kinds of issues. So the first question we have has to do with the relationship of the issue to the established doctrine of the dominant religion. So the question is this a policy change that requires a challenge to the established doctrine of the dominant religion? If it does, then we are calling it a doctrinal issue, which means it's in this kind of right-hand column. If it doesn't, then we're calling it a non-doctrinal issue. The other thing it could be, the other thing it could be is a class issue. And so I want to be clear that these are all gender issues, both doctrinal issues, non-doctrinal issues, class issues, and non-class-based issues. This is a typology of gender issues, of women's rights issues. None of them are not gender issues, but some of them strike at relations of class in ways that others do not. So, for example, questions of childcare and parental leave are fundamentally class issues in a way that, say, questions of abortion legality, just the legality of abortion, is not necessarily, or the way that violence against women is not. Again, it's not that there aren't class dimensions to these issues, but they're really fundamental to questions about parental leave. They're kind of about the relationship between women and the market in a kind of fundamental way. So if we are trying to explain these different issues, so if you look, sorry, if you just, we look at this slide for one more second, you can see that if we divide women's rights into these, along these dimensions, we have 4 categories of women's rights. One is non-doctrinal, one is class issues that are not doctrinal, one is that doctrinal issues that are not class issues, then there are issues that are both class issues and that are doctrinal, and there are issues that are neither. But all of these are 4 kinds of gender issues, 4 kinds of women's rights issues. So if we're explaining change on these issues then, change for these 4 categories, one of the ways we're trying to get at the puzzles that I mentioned before is by saying one way to understand the different patterns across these different issues is to pay attention to what type of issue it is that we're talking about, what type of women's rights issue. So organized feminism is particularly important for these new issues that are raised, that are articulated and put on the agenda by women's rights movements. So for example, things like violence against women and even certain ways of approaching reproductive rights, let's say as opposed to just the issue of abortion, but the kind of very big conceptual category of reproductive rights are kind of new issues that are articulated by organized feminism. And opposition and support for these issues varies. For gender issues that are affected, that are inflected with class, these class-based issues, the thing that we would expect there is that the pattern of state market relations matters. So you have to kind of look at already the ways that state market relations are institutionalized to try to understand like what's the kind of status quo ante with these issues. And then in terms of like actors that are driving change on these issues, we're talking about left parties and labor mobilization and unions and the like as being the forces that really drive change on these issues. So on the last type that we're talking about were doctrinal issues. On doctrinal issues, we are really saying that the key thing here is looking at institutionalized religion, the degree to which political institutions represent religious authority, political institutions and religious institutions combined. And you see this in a couple of kind of world historic forces that shape contemporary politics, like the forces of communism and colonialism. And on a kind of nation by nation level, this is sort of expressed, this sort of fusion of political and religious authority is expressed in the phenomenon of a constitutionally established religion. So for this kind of category of doctrinal issues, we expect that these institutional religious variables are the key explanations for change and variation in women's rights. We also think that international norms affect variation across these issues, but in a more complicated way. A key thing here are regional effects. So where regional organizations reinforce particular types of policy changes, those can be very powerful. International norms are critical in terms of providing extra pressure where, say, domestic movements are weaker, and so on. Okay, so if we just take that and map it onto the 4 categories I showed you before, you can see that we can kind of see that these different actors and institutional contexts that we've talked about for each issue can be used to kind of construct a framework or an explanatory framework or, you know, more detailed arguments for each of the kinds of issues that we've been talking about. So for those issues that are neither doctrinal nor that are class issues in a fundamental way, we see that, you know, feminist movements, the strength of feminist movements and the power of international norms tend to be determinative of policy outcomes. They're going to be they're going to kind of drive the bus for explaining differences and change over time. For those policy issues that are doctrinal, feminist movements may still matter, but religious institutions and the ways that kind of these forces of colonialism and communism, which shape the relationship between religion and the state, those are going to be the kinds of key factors. So you can see those would be quite different types of explanations you would give for those different issue areas. Going to class issues that are not doctrinal, again, we're going to say feminist movements could matter, but really the critical thing here are left parties and labor movements in terms of expanding, expanding rights in this economic and social rights. And those issues that are kind of all of these things, gender issues, class issues, doctrinal issues, we kind of see all of these factors come into play. So a much more complicated model for those, an explanation for those last kinds of issues. So how did we kind of go about developing, applying this framework to these to the kind of global argument that we were trying to make. We have both qualitative and quantitative evidence for this work. We developed a database of women's rights in 70 countries using primary sources, like here we're talking about the texts of the laws in many cases, but also newspapers, activist documents, government documents, and also secondary sources like, scholarly articles and the like. And we use this to develop our own database. And we worked for more than 12 years to gather and analyze this data. And our team at times included a dozen researchers, and it was funded by the National Science Foundation Political Science Program in the US. In addition to that, we did field work in a wide range of countries to kind of see if there was plausibility for some of the things that we were seeing in the broader global patterns, and to kind of really refine our models and make sure we had all the relevant factors. And that fieldwork took place in Argentina, Israel, Canada, the United States, Malaysia, Nigeria, China, India, and South Korea. So let me just give you a couple examples of some of the things that we talked about in terms of trying to understand the kind of differences across countries in women's rights. So first of all, let's start by looking at kind of what governments were doing about violence against women in Canada and Sweden in the 1980s and the 1990s. And this is kind of what we call a status issue. I guess it's not a class issue, it's not a doctrinal issue. It's primarily about kind of gender status, about the ways that institutions privilege or advantage feminine masculinity and denigrate the feminine. Okay, so violence against women is primarily one of these status issues. And then there's a couple other things I could tell you. I may or may not have time, but I'll try to touch on this Morocco 2004 reform of the family code, which is a doctrinal issue. If we have time, I can go back and talk to you more about the family leave versus equality at work in Norway and the US. Okay, so if we look at government action on violence against women in Canada and Sweden in the 80s and 90s, we see that in both countries there were activists demanding action. But there were very different kinds of stories. So first of all, in Canada, we actually saw that activists had been lobbying on this issue quite prominently, quite early, 1967. The Royal Commission on Status of Women, for example, came out with its 100 recommendations, which were all nearly implemented and were hugely criticized right away in 1967 by the feminist movement in Canada for not having violence against women as a more prominent issue. So this is when a lot of the world is not even really kind of talking about this issue yet. But in Canada, the feminist movement was already pushing for this issue and advocating for it. There was a Secretary of State women's programs in Canada. This is kind of like a government office that funded women's organizations, funded research. And it was actually very influential in building the feminist movement, particularly issues of violence against women. It funded women's centers, it funded research. And this research led to a series of amendments that were proposed. This rape shield law was very quickly adopted in 1983. And sometimes, when we are talking about, sometimes some of the evidence I'll present later is quite correlational. And, the question is like, how do you really know that the proposals by these feminists were the ones that influenced the government activity? And in this case, it's really pretty smoking gun-ish in the sense that the National Association for Women in the Law proposal, which was endorsed by the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, these are the two big women's organizations that were active at this time, literally formed the basis for the amendments. The language of that proposal became the amendments that were taken. And similarly, kind of looking forward on sexual assault, in 1991, this no means no sexual assault law was adopted. Again, extensive consultation with feminists. They're criticizing the government. They're demanding change. And, this is around the time when government policy is really seen as adopting like the language of feminism into its policy, like the war on women and this sort of thing. And the thing to look at is that during this time, women were less than 10% of parliament when these big expansions in sexual assault law took place. And they happened under both liberal, which here is the kind of like centrist party, and conservative parties, both the centrist party and a conservative party, maybe center left, depends on the years. But these were kind of varying ideological bases. The two main parties, both of the two main parties oversaw these exchanges. Now, if we look at Sweden over the same period, there were feminist efforts to raise this issue of violence against women, and feminist research actually revealed that the levels of violence were about the same in both countries around this time. So as feminists were trying to raise this issue, they were characterized as shrill and divisive, and people tried to deny that this was really an issue in Sweden, although we know better now. And protective orders were not adopted in Sweden until about a decade later than they were adopted in Canada, the United States, and the UK, where they were developed in the late 1970s. There was actually no public support and for specialized rape crisis centers, which are still quite few. And as late as 2011 in Sweden, there was a legal category of minor rape for drunk or unconscious women with no required penalty. And if you want to read a really scathing report of the rape law, not just in Sweden, but across the Nordic region, you could look at Amnesty International's 2010 report on rape and rape laws in Scandinavia, which kind of covers these and many other issues. And again, to kind of keep it in your mind, at this time, when there's really not much happening in the area of sexual assault legal reform in Scandinavia, there's not much happening in the area of service provision. The percentage of women in government is quite high. It's between 27 and 40%. There's a left party there from 1982. I mean, this whole period is a period where kind of, if you're thinking about the kind of left party model, women in government model of policymaking, it should have been responsive, and yet it wasn't. Now, I mentioned there was a feminist movement, but we should notice some differences here, that the feminist movement in Sweden is largely contained in these kind of government bodies, and is mostly, I mean, not entirely, right, but mostly not autonomous, not independent of these government bodies or even of political parties and institutions, and not particularly strong. So what we really lack here is a strong autonomous feminist movement, even though we have all these other things. So, this kind of suggests that what's the difference between Canada and Sweden? Well, there are many differences, but they're not what you might think. You might expect the reverse in the terms of pattern of political parties or women in government. What you really see is that Canada policy is driven by the strong autonomous feminist movement that is articulating the issues, demanding policy change, preparing policy briefs and draft legislation, and making the difference. And we just don't see the same level of kind of strong autonomous organizing in Sweden over the same period. I'm going to skip this part for time considerations, but I'll come back to it if you want. So now I want to show you a story about Moroccan family law. So I want to kind of contrast the issues of violence against women and family law, and I'll do a little bit more further on as well. So hopefully this will help explain a little bit later. But if we look at Moroccan family law, one of the things that's striking is that here's a case where family law goes from being pretty similar to the rest of the region to really kind of being overhauled to the point that some observers consider it to be a feminist version of Sharia. The family law in Morocco is dramatically changed and is considered a model by many for feminist legal reform in the region. So again, in Morocco, important influential women's movement in the early 1990s, the 1 million signatures campaign, which is kind of globally famous. You may have even heard of it and has been emulated elsewhere, prompted in 1993 some modest reforms. And Morocco ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, in the same year. And these reforms were rather disappointing to the activists who demanded them. Of course, they were pleased to have progress, but they really didn't make the fundamental changes that feminists had hoped for. And in 1997, when Morocco made its report to CEDAW, to the committee that goes along with this Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the biting criticism was not well received by the government, and immediately the kind of the socialists who were in power tried to start working on doing better. The shadow report from feminists at CEDAW embarrassed the government, and they wanted to do better. So there was a proposed reform in 1999. And this was protested by Islamic religious authorities, and huge protests erupted, and the proposals were shelved because of this. Then in 2003, there was a kind of a new king and continued feminist pressure. And a key thing that happened here actually was a terrorist attack, which actually undercut the legitimacy of the Islamists and allowed kind of opening for kind of this feminist pressure to make a difference. So with a new kind of interest in reform, a little bit of weakening of the legitimacy of these Islamist feminist pressure, they actually participated in the reform process, and this dramatic overhaul was accomplished with the support of the kind of same people who opposed the 1993 reforms 10 years later. So different story, but you can't tell the story and understand what's happening without paying attention to the kind of role of kind of religious political mobilization, and how they were kind of stronger and weaker at different times. Okay. So let me kind of try to take these stories that I've just been telling you and giving you a bit more of a kind of a global picture of how this story works out. And the study in the book that I mentioned covers a wide range of issues, but here I'm just going to pull two out to show you. Violence against women, which, as I said, is a status issue, and family law, which is a doctrinal issue. And I just want you to notice how different these issues are. So let me start by talking about government action to redress violence against women over 1975 to 2005. And the research that we did, we scored the policies in these countries over this period between 0 and 10, with 10 being a more expansive policy adoption and 0 being less expansive. And we gave kind of 10 points out, as this index describes, in a way that covered services to victims, different kinds of legal reform, 3 different areas of legal reform, whether there were programs or policies targeted to vulnerable populations of women, whether there are training for professionals, prevention programs, and administrative reforms to address violence against women. So 10 means you're doing all these things. So if you look at this in 1975, this is just showing you, that really the white parts here are areas that are not covered by our study. But the rest of the globe, you can see, is pretty uniform, right? There's not much variation in terms of action on violence against women. Basically, there's not much policy development. By 1985, you can start to see that some countries are starting to take action on violence against women. As I mentioned earlier, Australia, Canada, and the United States are first to act, also Sweden and Britain. So we're seeing a few countries, handful of countries here that are taking action, but most are still not taking action. And notably, the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, this time 1985, it is still the Soviet Union. Nothing is happening on violence against women. Now, by 1995, you can see quite a bit of variation. So we've gone from seeing kind of uniform responsiveness to quite a bit of variation. By 1995, Australia, Canada, and the United States are the most responsive policy regimes in the world when it comes to violence against women. And again, nobody's suggesting the perfect policy regimes, there's not more they could do or anything like that, but just comparatively much stronger. But Latin America also, at this point, this is the thing I mentioned earlier about how Latin America is more responsive. If you look at Europe, you can see that countries like Italy and other European nations are actually, you would expect to see more development there if you thought that kind of richer countries were going to do better than poorer countries. The Middle East, North Africa region, the MENA region, again, very little change here in terms of violence against women. If we look at 2005, again, we see kind of more convergence. Again, Latin America continuing to show more progress on violence against women. Greater, again, great variation within Europe, though, right? I mean, there are some countries here that are kind of starting to get to this level of having the highest level that we talked about. But still, in the MENA region, mostly very little change. Okay, now let me show you a similar kind of set of maps that describe the level of gender equality in family law. If we do the same thing where we say higher scores are more equality and lower scores are less equality, we have made an index for gender equality in family law that covers 70 countries, again, 1975 to 2005, same set of countries as before. And this index that I'm going to show you now ranges between 1 and 13, with 1 point for each area of equality. We looked at 13 different areas of family law: divorce, parental rights, property rights, all these kinds of things that are driven by family law, areas of family law. The preamble, is the preamble one that elevates equality or one that emphasizes inequality in marriage, so on. So higher scores reflect more equality, lower scores reflect less equality. These are the various areas that we looked at: marriage age, consent to marry, ban on marriage of certain people, spousal rights and obligations, are they roughly equal, so on and so forth, guardianship, rights to children, rights to divorce, adultery. Okay, if we look at 1975, you can see that right off the bat, there's tremendous variation. So think about the violence against women map I just showed you a few minutes ago. That was looking pretty similar from 1975. In family law, we see tremendous variation in 1975. Lots of differences. And interestingly, you'll also remember that when we looked at violence against women in 1975, we saw that in the post-communist region, or in the Soviet Union at that time, in the communist region, there was little action on violence against women. But you can see that legal equality is, in the area of family law, is the norm across the Soviet Union already by 1975, more so than in other countries. And you see that, of course, there's quite a bit of equality in family law in Europe, less in Middle East, North Africa region, and less in East Asia. By 1985, again, we're seeing increased equality in family law. Again, there's the sort of same pattern in the MENA region as you saw the decade before. And again, 1995, again, the MENA region stands out as a region which is not really converging. By now, Canada, US, Australia have developed, greater equality in family law, in spite of the trickiness of reforming, in some cases, the common law areas. But the MENA region shows some stickiness, and East Asia also not really changing too much. So by 2005, these patterns are still sort of persisting that we've just been pointing out. So, what do we make of this? Well, one thing that should be clear from looking at these maps and the stories that I told you is that the whatever explanation it is for why women's rights are so different across these countries in terms of family law and over time, and the same for violence against women, these can't be the same explanatory models, right? The patterns are completely different, right? They're different over time, they're different. So, I mean, there has to be something different about the ways these issues are working. And what could it be? So one thing we did to kind of really try to drive home the fact that our framework applies different models for different areas is to take kind of like one model, one kind of explanation, and apply it statistically to this global data set for 6 different policy areas. So just like these indicators that we showed you for violence against women and family law, we created these for 6 different policy areas. And then showed how, if you apply the same model to each of these policy areas, you get different results. Now, that isn't very satisfactory from the perspective of actually understanding those different issue areas. So we have in the book, we spend quite a bit of time looking at what are the things that really make each kind of issue area different. So it's really exploring the role of religion for doctrinal issues, feminist movements for status issues, kind of left parties and labor mobilization for class issues. So kind of really spending more time on that. But here I'm just going to show you some kind of preliminary kind of overview results. So first of all, if we did this kind of comparison across all these issues for 70 countries from 1975 to 2005, I'll show you now this ordinary least squares regression, which is a panel data analysis with panel corrected standard errors. But we also used random effects and other kinds of techniques if you're interested in hearing about that. And also in some models, we have used lagged variables, which reduces our data down to 3 time periods. And by that, I mean, you saw like, what does it mean if you have like some institutional factor in 10 decades prior, because many of the processes we're talking about are not the kinds of things that change like that, right? Institutional processes or, large scale social change that's spawned by movements takes a little more than a year or 2. So usually, sometimes you want to look at these times over longer periods. Okay. So in these models, we looked at some of the explanatory factors I mentioned in the framework in the beginning: feminist model, feminist movement strength, CEDAW ratification kind of for international norms, religious legislation, whether how religious the population is, that's from the World Values Survey, whether the country is majority Catholic or majority Muslim, what kind of parties are in government, whether it's a former colony, whether there's a communist legacy, and of course, a series of control variables for national wealth, democracy level, numbers of women in government, and so on. So for each area of women's rights, these are the areas we covered. We did violence against women, or at least this table shows, family law, abortion, And abortion is abortion legality in this particular analysis, not because we think that's all there is to abortion, but because of our typology, we want to separate legal dimensions from abortion from reproductive rights funding, which is a class dimension of abortion rights. So look at legality of abortion and then look at kind of funding for reproductive rights more generally, including contraception. And last, we looked at some areas of economic and social rights, including maternity and parental leave, women's legal status at work, and also childcare, which we didn't show here because the analysis is a little different for practical reasons. So each of these, in order to make it comparable, we made each of these indices measure from 0 to 10 just for this analysis. Now remember, this is the same in that lower numbers are less equality promoting, higher numbers are policies that are more equality promoting. Now, this is pretty difficult to look at, and I don't expect you to understand it. But the key thing I want to show you is that if you look down the left-hand side of the column, these are all the different variables or explanatory factors. And if you look across the top, those are the different areas that each model is being applied to, different dependent variables, different explanatory outcomes that we're trying to get at, policies in each area. And for this purpose, we're just bolding those coefficients which are statistically significant and those which are not bolded. And so the reason for doing this is just to kind of give you a quick visual that you can see that different things are bolded and not bolded in different models without getting into the size or the direction or anything like that right now. So part of what we were trying to say is that this kind of an explanation does not work the same way for each model. So you see that feminist movements are pretty much the most powerful explanation across these different areas, but the kind of size of the impact is different, and the direction of the impact appears to be different in some cases. So if you look at the leave generosity, for example, it's negative where it's positive in each of the other models. So in general, let me just show you this. So if I kind of pull some stuff out because that table is too hard to understand in its entirety. Let me just pull a few things out of it that I'll show you in more detail, and just to highlight a few things that are findings from that table. So the first thing is that feminist movement, and that table, all these tables are in the books and in the book and online available. Feminist movements are important in advancing sex equality for every policy area except for family leave, as I mentioned, but they matter in different ways. And you know, why do they matter? Well, as I kind of suggested in that early Canada-Sweden experiment, the thing that, or comparison, I should say, the thing that the feminist movements are doing in that situation is articulating distinctive concerns, those of a particular group of women or those particular concerns, and pushing for them, creating the political pressure and the political will to get that issue on the kind of public or policy agenda. Now, in some areas, we're not just putting a new issue on the policy agenda or pushing for a new issue. We're talking about reform of well-established legal frames, and often there's considerable entrenched opposition because there was already kind of a prior history of kind of institutional relationships on this. So when feminist efforts at reform get entangled in these state-church relations, which are pre-existing and which already have a whole set of institutionalized interactions, opposition here is a much more complicated affair. So there's religious opposition here, and it's based on these institutionalized relationships. So in those circumstances, even strong movements may take longer to have an impact because of these barriers. And so that's why we'd say they use a lagged variable in those models. So here you can see this model just uses a lagged model, but if you go into our book, you'll see that some of them use the lagged model and some don't. But if using this lagged model, which works more, works for some issues and not others, you can see that the feminist movement is significant in each of these models and positive except for leave generosity, which is not unexpected. Okay, so if we look specifically at violence against women, which I talked to you about before, you can see that a strong autonomous feminist movement is a powerful predictor of action on violence against women. And even more interesting is the interaction between the strong autonomous feminist movement and the ratification of CEDAW. So as you can see there, it's important here. And we found this to be a powerful explanation for action on violence against women in many different contexts. And again, if you're interested in that, our book has more detail on that, but we also have an APSR article on this American Political Science Review article on this particular question as well. Another kind of thing I want to draw out of our analysis to highlight for you are our findings on religion. And actually, I'm really keen on these, on exactly what we found here. So I'm happy to talk to you about it more. But I'll try to keep it brief for now so that we have time for questions. And I'll just say that the coefficients on these religious variables show that really across all, for all of the doctrinal issues, you'll see that the religious variables show a sign that are in the expected direction that is negative. More religiosity reduces gender equality in these various areas. But we also want to point out that our thesis about institutional variables mattering the most also finds some support here, right? It seems like it's the institutional variables that make the difference, and it matters for family law, although it doesn't necessarily show up here. And one of the things, and so what the interesting you might see is that if you look at this table, you can see that like a Muslim majority matters for family law, but not for abortion legality. So that's even though it's a doctrinal issue, that makes sense from our theoretical perspective, because actually abortion is not the same doctrinal significance in those countries where Islam is the established doctrine. Family law is far more salient as a kind of issue of religious conflict than abortion. In Catholic countries, though, you can see the Catholic majority countries are kind of significant for abortion legality, where abortion is a much more politically salient issue for Catholics. So these official religion variables are the ones that are really important. These institutional variables are the ones that have the power, and really, I could do more with this if we had more time. But the key thing is too that that's really where you get explanatory power. Like if you just look at whether countries are predominantly Muslim or not, as this figure suggests, you can see that explains some of the variation. But really, you're not getting much of a handle on explaining why some countries have more egalitarian family laws than others. If you even look at religiosity, look, you see some relationship here, sure. As you get to higher levels of religiosity, you certainly see lower levels of equality. But what's more surprising is that, you also see some countries with high levels of religiosity that have high levels of equality. So what's the difference here? This is the thing you want to know, right? How much of this difference is explained by religiosity? Well, some, but again, not all. And if you're a person who likes scatter plots, you know that this is the kind of nice, tight scatter plot that you'd like to see when you see something that's a good explanation, when there's a tighter correlation, which is that there's a negative relationship here between religious institutions and inequality in family law. And that better than just kind of doctrine, better than kind of whether you're Muslim or Catholic, better than whether you're religious or not, actually the institutional dimension of religion is what gets us this explanation, much more explanatory power than the other ways of thinking about it. Okay, so I won't go into that right now. Now, left parties. I didn't talk too much about the difference between family leave in Norway and the United States, but if I did, you would have understood why left parties are so important in all these models, except for family law reform. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to I'll just point to it for now, the differences between the legality of abortion and reproductive rights funding. So if you look at abortion rules, we don't see that left parties have the same kind of impact that they do when we're looking at specifically like funding for contraception and funding for abortion. Left parties, there's really a different model, even just for legality of abortion and access to funding for reproductive rights. So it's actually quite pronounced. So that in some ways is a very good test of our argument that there are differences just in the kinds of market-based, kind of class-based dimensions of these gender issues and those issues that are not fundamentally these kinds of class issues. And so to just kind of conclude, what we're trying to say here is that women's rights are not a kind of single basket of issues, and that in order to really understand what's going on with women's rights, with kind of gender equality, if we want to understand, like, how do we understand the political dynamics that drive change in gender rights, that explain differences across countries, we actually have to disaggregate them into multiple dimensions to understand them. And when we look at these issues, we can say that feminist movements matter most for the kinds of status issues that we're talking about, and that religious and institutional contexts that enable or obstruct organized religion shape doctrinal issues, and that left parties matter the most for class issues, although I didn't explain that much in this presentation. We also found that international norms matter more when they are run into less opposition domestically or fit with certain domestic values like maternity leave or contraception. So if we go back to those puzzles that I told you at the very beginning, these explanations help. This kind of framework that I just showed you helps explain those puzzles that I talked about. So remember we were saying, like, why are Nordic countries better at maternity leave and Anglo-American countries do more on violence against women? Well, part of this has to do with the pattern of where we find autonomous and strong feminist movements. We find them in Canada, but not in Sweden. We find regional agreements on violence against women in Latin America that provided a strong accelerant or boost to the autonomous feminist movements there when no such regional agreement developed in Europe. When it did, as you saw in the later periods, we see similar pick up the pace, similar accelerant in policy development on this issue in Europe. Left parties matter a lot for the family leave differences. So that's why we see, the U.S. has no left party. It has a strong autonomous feminist movement. That sort of explains the differences across those issues. So richer countries are not always more progressive than poorer countries. Again, this is partly because of the impact of regional agreements in Latin America and these kinds of transnational connections. You can see that Phil Ayub in his Cambridge book made a similar argument about LGBT rights, which I think is pretty interesting. And last, in the kind of question about like region, religion, and family of nations, as I said, so like why do some of these Islamic countries reform their law and some don't? The thing that we found was the thing that really set apart some of these countries from others was the kind of the role of the institutional developments of religion. So if you just look at how religious a country is, whether it's Islamic or not, some of these other things, you're not going to understand whether there's a potential for change. It's really how much fusion is there between religious and secular authorities. How much do the political institutions uphold religious principles? That tells you how much of an obstacle there's going to be to kind of getting political change. And it also suggests some things about strategy that I could elaborate if we wanted in the discussion. So to just kind of make a point, this multidimensional approach to women's rights that I've just been using this whole talk is really a kind of intersectional understanding of gender, that class and religion and other dimensions, social axes, define distinct dimensions of gender. Again, we're not saying they're not gender issues. We're just saying they're different types of gender issues. So we're also just saying that key institutions and identities define different political processes for each type of issue. So women and women's rights share many things, but women's and women's rights are not all the same. And then finally, we might say that a key lesson here is, that women don't agonize. There's an old slogan, don't agonize, organize. And this old slogan holds true in some ways, although in some instances, institutional reform could facilitate or even be necessary for big changes in women's rights. So I'll stop there and take your questions. I hope I didn't go for too long. I guess I went for longer than I meant to, but